Fantastic. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caroline Beckman. I am the Resilient Homes Program Manager at Climate Resilient Communities, a community-based organization that works here in the peninsula, mostly in East Palo Alto, in the Bellhaven neighborhood of Menlo Park, and in North Fair Oaks, to empower low-income and under-resourced residents to enact climate change solutions. So lots to talk about today. I'm really delighted that we have a nice intimate group, because what I would really like this to be today is a discussion and a conversation. I know that there's a lot of expertise and experience here, just among the folks I know, and I'm sure among the folks I don't, that I'd just love to have this be a conversation where we can share our collective experience and think about how we can strive for equitable electrification in San Mateo County. If anyone would be willing to jump in and introduce themselves and let me know where you're calling in from, I would love to get a sense of the room. So I'll just leave it open for anyone who cares to share, either in the chat or to be brave and come off mute to say hi. And let me see, I can open the chat here. Ashley from Palo Alto. Thank you for being the brave first one, Ashley. And if other folks are eating some lunch or off doing other things, that is a-okay. Fantastic. Oh, I love having students involved in these conversations. You guys know so much more than I did. And I'm so glad to have you in the room. Thank you, Julia. Fantastic. San Mateo. Awesome. Okay, well, I'll leave it there. And if anyone else has moved to share a little bit about yourself in the chat, please feel free to do so. It is there. But I will jump into a few slides I have here. There we go. So my roadmap for today is, first I'm going to share a little bit about CRC, what it is that we do, some real quick background on the specific impacts of climate change that are most facing these areas that we work in, and then to talk about how we work towards equitable electrification in our work, some of the roadblocks that I see in existing policy, and the ways that organizations and programs in our area and more broadly are starting to work at righting some of those issues. And then I'll hope to open it up for some discussion about how we as a group can brainstorm policies and practices that can promote equitable paths forward as we think about decarbonization. So CRC, as I said, is a community-based organization that works mostly in East Palo Alto, Bellhaven, and North Fair Oaks. On the map here on the left, those are the areas with the hatched white marks on them. And this still is from CalEnviroScreen, which I'm sure most of you know about, but this is essentially a map where it takes all the census tracts across California and measures their sort of aggregate pollution burden, as well as some social vulnerability characteristics of the neighborhood. And what immediately sticks out at me whenever you look at these maps in our general area is you can see the amazing amount of inequality that exists just across one single road, just right across the freeway. So in East Palo Alto, Bellhaven, and North Fair Oaks, as well as Redwood City, which is up to the left, there is a lot of industrial pollution from the roads, from industrial sites. There's historic hazards. And these are also communities that are historically redlined and experience a lot more vulnerability characteristics than like Palo Alto and the other side of Menlo Park or Atherton. CRC has three main program areas, all aimed at different levels of thinking about climate change solutions, all the way from the individual level, where we have an education program that works with youth, also with community members to learn about climate change. What is climate change? How is it impacting our communities? What can we do about it? The Resilient Homes program, which I manage, and I'll talk about quite a bit more in just a little bit, sort of thinking about that household level, about how your individual home is your first line of defense against climate change. And then all the way up to our adaptation program, which is really at the community infrastructure level as well as policy. So lightning quick overview of CRC and our broader work to situate this conversation. And I know this is review, I'm sure, for a lot of you, so I'll just touch on this really quickly. But my overall point of this overview of climate change in East Palo Alto is to say that climate change is not a far off issue. It is already here. It is something that these communities are dealing with every day, that we have been dealing with even so far this month, and that it is a really, really tangible threat. So this here is a FEMA flood map of East Palo Alto on the left. And you can see that rising sea levels are going to dramatically change and reshape the East Palo Alto landscape. Right now, 51% of East Palo Alto, so just over half, lies within a FEMA flood zone, which means that there is a high probability of these areas in the next 10 to 20 years regularly experiencing inundation from regular tides. These projections for sea level rise are obviously slightly unsure. So that ranges anywhere from holding steady at about that 51% to nearly 2/3 of East Palo Alto regularly experiencing flooding during tides. Climate change isn't just sea level rise. Flooding isn't just sea level rise. I threw in another map here just to talk about that flooding can also be from extreme rainfall like we had just this month. In 1998, there was a flood much like the one that just happened earlier this month in East Palo Alto, where over 1,000 homes were inundated. And there have been some significant improvements to infrastructure since then. But earlier this month, actually, I think it was January 2nd or 3rd, basically New Year's, the San Francisco Creek was still topped in one location and resulted in flooding along Manhattan Avenue, which is some of the area here where you can see in the very dark blue color at the extreme risk level for flooding. And about 40 residents lost their cars that were stored in underground parking garages. So I use this example just to say, and to reinforce again, climate change is here, it is happening, residents are already feeling the impacts. And so what CRC and other organizations are trying to do is to figure out how can we adapt to these changing situations? How can we make our communities safer and more resilient in the face of these impacts going forward? Is there anything else I want to say about this map? No, I think I just want to dwell here on, this is a risk factor map looking at flooding from both sea level rise and from extreme rainfall events. And looking at the panel here on the right, just really seeing it's quite unusual to see for a neighborhood so many of the risk factors being extreme or major. It's always interesting to go plug in other areas into these types of maps. So I'd encourage you after this presentation to take a look around the county as a whole and see what those numbers look like other places. Last point here before we dive a little bit more into the specifics of this presentation, but asthma and air pollution are extremely prevalent in these communities. For some of the reasons I mentioned right at the beginning, there is a lot of traffic from cut-through traffic. That's especially an issue in the Belhaven neighborhood where I think about 80% of the traffic, it's been mapped that 80% of the traffic going through Belhaven doesn't start or stop in Belhaven. It's just going through to jobs or on commutes. You also have industrial sites. So East Palo Alto, for a long time, there was a hazardous waste facility called Romic that was operating right along the shoreline and was obviously having some harmful byproducts for residents. Those kinds of facilities are much harder to place in more affluent neighborhoods. And so you tend to see the phenomenon of these sites being placed in low-income areas. And really, that's a consequence of redlining, as I mentioned. It's a consequence of disinvestment. It's a consequence of systemic racism. And as a result of that, many individuals in these three neighborhoods suffer from many chronic breathing conditions and other health issues. East Palo Alto is 2 to 3 times more likely to have young people going to the emergency room or the doctor for asthma related reasons than the rest of the county. It's about the same for Bellhaven, about 2 times more likely. And in North Fair Oaks, it's about 3 times more likely, which I think is just one of many factors and statistics that one could use to show just how big of an issue this is for residents. So I think that sets it up well to show really what the need is in these communities, that climate change is here, and what can we do about it. So I'll talk about my program, which is the Resilient Homes program, really working with residents to do 3 things: to reduce energy costs where possible, to improve overall home health, and to gain access to subsidized resources for electrification and other home repairs. There are a lot of programs that exist that are meant for low-income residents to help them save money, to help them live better lives. That ranges everything from, SNAP or food stamps to Medi-Cal to subsidized programs to give families solar panels completely for free. There are lots of programs out there, but they can be really hard to know about, and they're even harder to apply for. So a lot of these programs have pretty complicated requirements about proving that you are low income, about showing how many people are living in the house, lots of different requirements that are hard to keep track of. And that's if people even know about the programs to begin with. So CRC acts as what I call a case manager. So we work with residents where we get in touch with someone, they reach out to us. We talk through sort of their wish list, their needs for their home, of everything from I need a grab bar in the shower so I don't slip and fall, to I've heard about solar panels, my neighbor got them, I'd be really interested. So we sort of work with them on a multidimensional sense of what home health and wellness means. And then we work to connect that resident with programs that we think could fit those needs best. Sometimes one program, sometimes multiple programs. And we help them complete the application, gather the documents, and really shepherd through the process from the beginning to the end to make sure that the improvements are made. To date, we've had over 200 families complete projects with us, again, ranging from very small, minor accessibility improvements all the way to multiple appliance electrification projects. And really, I think for me, what is the key to this program is energy equity. And I will talk more about that later, but something that's really prevalent in these communities is that it's a fact nationwide that Black, brown, and under-resourced communities are more likely to live in older homes. And for a variety of reasons, those are less resilient to the impacts of climate change. So you can think about older homes not being built for energy efficiency in the same way that newer constructions would be. So they don't, hold heat as well. They're more expensive to maintain. But then also you think about wear and tear over time. I'll dive much more into this. I think this is a key area that thinking about new programs is really starting to do some good work to think about the fact that it's a lot harder to electrify and maintain older homes. But that's why CRC comes at it from a perspective of whole home health, that you can't just come in thinking about one specific type of repair, like, oh, we want to bring solar panels to everyone in East Palo Alto. That would be great, but that is not going to meet the needs of every resident, and that's not going to be feasible in every home. So zooming back out a little bit, and I know that this is something I'm sure you've talked about in other presentations today, but in addition to just the importance of climate change mitigation, I think electrification is key to our work, and it's something we've been thinking about more and more for 2 reasons in particular. The first is health, and it builds directly on those maps I was showing you earlier of air pollution, which is to say that cooking on indoor gas stoves or having gas appliances in your home, because of the way they produce heat through combustion, lets off NO2, benzene, other chemicals that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but just various chemicals that if you are in an area where asthma is very prevalent to begin with, you have very high risks of cooking with those kinds of appliances, heating your home with those kinds of appliances, aggravating those issues. We're currently working on another project at CRC that's a research partnership with Stanford University, where we're trying to put indoor air quality monitors inside people's homes so that we can see how indoor air quality compares to outdoor air quality. And here on the bottom left of the screen, I don't know if you can see my cursor. You'd think I know this about Zoom at this point, but I still don't. But on the bottom left of this slide, you can see a snapshot from one of those indoor air monitors that we installed last year. And something that was shocking to us, to me, is that at mealtimes, when you're cooking on a stove, you see these massive spikes in indoor air pollution. Just the air quality going from being pretty fine, generally a little bit worse than outside, but still pretty fine, to just being in the deeply unhealthy range. And so that, I think, for me was a big moment of, wow, we're seeing this play out in our local data, some of the things that scientists and researchers have been talking about for a long time. In addition to health, the second aspect I think electrification is important to talk about in these communities is financial. So this graph here shows energy expenditures as a percentage of household income. And you can see really clearly that lower income communities spend much more of their overall income to fuel their cars, heat their homes, just energy expenditures overall. That's important just as a baseline to understand. But as we think about a decarbonization movement or an electrification transition, whatever words you want to use, as fewer and fewer people are on gas lines, they will become more expensive to maintain. Gas will become more expensive. And I think that unless we think about electrification as something that is especially important to offer to low-income communities, that gulf is just going to get wider and wider. You can see it's already there, like over 35% of an income being used for energy needs is already crazy. But if we think about that increasing even more, I think there's no clear rationale for why equitable electrification is important. With all that being said, that was a lot of setup to talk about specific electrification needs. And I've alluded to some of these already, but I think it's good to just put them out there to talk for a little bit about some of the reasons why equitable electrification can be hard and hasn't been talked about as much over the last few years, although that's starting to change. The first are financial barriers and incentive structures. Second is deferred maintenance, and the third is renters. So this first piece is really relevant to all of the residents we work with through our Resilient Homes program, which is simply to say that replacing appliances to move towards electrification or buying a new car to move towards electrification is really freaking expensive. I've put up some statistics here just from some programs we've worked with that often replacing a gas appliance with an electric one is more expensive. So just on the face value, just on the sticker value of the appliance itself, it can add up to a lot. Even when there are rebate or programs to help make those transitions less expensive, something that pops up a lot is panel upgrades, panels with code violations, switching to get an outlet that will support an electric appliance. It adds up really fast and can be totally overwhelming. I don't know if anyone in the chat has had experience with electrification themselves in their own home or knows anyone who has, but I think a common experience of folks that I know is that you start thinking you know exactly how much it's going to cost you, and then you open up the walls and it's a totally different situation. I'm seeing some people pop on video, so maybe that really resonated with folks. Yes, and tons of issues do arise. Yeah, so I think in addition to the issues, the various, snafus, there's also a piece about incentive structures here where programs that exist to, say, make it cheaper to switch out your water heater for an electric one when your gas one breaks down. What's the right way to say this? Get about 90% of the way there, but don't necessarily think about some of the impacts on community members. So say my water heater goes out, I need to buy a new one. I really care about the environment. I really care about climate change. So I want to switch to a heat pump water heater. Everyone keeps talking about these amazing things. They just sound like science fiction. They sound so awesome. And I know of some rebate programs that will help pay for half of that water heater to make it just as expensive as getting a new gas one. But those rebate programs, they will pay me back for half of it, but I still have to find the $1,500 to pay for it up front. That doesn't help me. I can care about the environment as much as I want to, but unless the incentive is structured in a way that can help me pay for it now, I'm not going to be able to pay for a $1,500 appliance with half the money coming back at some point. And so that's just one specific example. But when we think about tax credit structures, things like that, something that is really important to keep in mind is that a lot of incentive structures right now rely on someone having enough spare income to be able to cover things out of pocket and take rebates or tax credits or whatever the incentive is later down the line. Oh, let's see, how do I progress? Oh, okay. I clearly didn't number these right, but the second issue I want to talk about is deferred maintenance. And I alluded to this earlier, that a lot of these homes that we work in are old and they have a lot of different problems that have to be addressed before electrification is even possible. I think the best way to do this is to use an example of a resident that we worked with last year who lives in East Palo Alto, called us up, knew Violet, our executive director, and was really interested in getting solar panels. Her neighbor and friend had gotten solar panels through assistance program so that her neighbor didn't pay anything and now had these beautiful new solar panels. She was like, sign me up. How do I do it? We came by and looked at her house and noticed some immediate issues where, first off, her roof was leaking in a couple places, which was leading to mold, which you can see in this picture here. And that there was just a lot of signs, even from my very untrained contractor eye, that there were some problems with this roof. And that's an issue because to put solar panels on a roof, you need at least 10 to 15 years left of roof life. You know, you need to know that when you're putting a giant piece of technology on the roof, that the roof's going to be fine and you're not going to have to worry about it for quite a long period of time. So for this resident, before it was even possible for her to think about solar panels, first she had to get an entirely new roof. And while this repair program, this solar panel program would pay for the solar panels completely for free, she was having to figure out how to get an entirely new roof totally on her own. And so I point this out as an example of two things, one of which is that it's impossible to think about electrification without also thinking about the overall health of the home as a whole. I don't think personally that it's very useful to be thinking about adding solar panels, about switching out all the appliances in a home, adding a brand new AC system that is based on a heat pump if a house has 4 broken windows and isn't going to be able to insulate to the outside in. I don't think it's very useful to be thinking about putting solar panels on homes unless we're also thinking about the fact that we need to make sure that the roofs are going to hold up. I don't think it's all that useful to be thinking about how much healthier gas stoves are when we're not also thinking about mold like this closet. Right? Like there's just so many intersecting issues that looking at electrification without also thinking about the totality of these residents and their whole situation, you're only getting a tiny, tiny piece of the puzzle, and you're making it much more likely that the electrification will truly be useful and be possible for the residents that we're trying to hit. And then the last piece is obviously renters. So 40% of San Mateo County rents. I rent. I'm sure lots of folks here also rent. San Mateo is a very renter-heavy county, but in East Palo Alto, North Fair Oaks, and I don't have Bellhaven on here. I meant to add Bellhaven. It's even higher. So it's about 51% of East Palo Alto rents, 57% of North Fair Oaks. I think it's about 49% of Bellhaven rents, 48 or 49. Diane, if you're still here, you might actually know off the top of your head. And it's immediately obvious, but perhaps bears repeating, that if you're a renter, you can't do things to your own home without checking in with your landlord. And for a lot of these programs that are aimed at low-income homes, families, if they don't explicitly have a provision for being for single family homes only, which is almost all the programs are just for single family homes, the programs we refer folks to for electrification. If it's not explicitly for single family homes only, there are really specific provisions of how and when renters can be involved. So it's usually only for small buildings where there are 4 units or less. Okay, great, glad to hear it. Thanks, Diane. Usually only 4 or less units in a building are eligible for these kinds of programs, and renters, obviously, for liability reasons, have to get landlord sign off, which is a huge issue for many of the residents that we work with. It's super common. I was working with a resident in North Fair Oaks earlier. Oh gosh, it was last year at this point because it's 2023 now. Last year, where she was trying to get not even anything major. She was trying to get a broken window fixed in her apartment, and she couldn't afford to pay for it. So she was working with us to find a program that could do it. But in order to get the repair work done through a county-funded program, she needed to get her landlord to sign off on it. And unfortunately for her, that was just a no-go, because essentially the relationship that she had, and the relationship that many folks have, is that if they don't come to their landlord with issues, then their landlord doesn't raise their rent. And that's just how it is I don't talk to you, you don't talk to me, we just continue on as usual. Another concern that people sometimes have is, well, if I do all this work to apply for these programs, if I get a new appliance or if I get the window fixed, is my rent going to go up, right? Because you have materially improved the quality of that property. Is it within the landlord's right to then say, oh, great, thank you so much. You know, your rent's now going to be $200 more expensive per month. There are a lot of issues baked in of trying to create programs that specifically help renters, that these kinds of things need to be thought through in order to actually meet the needs of these residents. And listening to folks and talking to folks, I think, is the best way to understand what those issues are. So I just feel like that was a lot of doom and gloom. So I do want to talk about the fact that these are questions that people in our area, more broadly, nationally, are actively thinking about. So within our area, one program that actively exists is Peninsula Clean Energy's Home Upgrade Program. And I think they might have spoken earlier today. Peninsula Clean Energy might have spoken, but we work really closely with this program that is aimed at electrification. Peninsula Clean Energy is San Mateo County's local electricity provider, and they provide clean energy at low rates for all residents in San Mateo County. But in addition to just providing energy, they have a lot of programs to sort of incentivize an electrification transition. And their home upgrade program is their effort to do that with low-income residents. So this is a program that's only for homeowners, but essentially they work with 2 groups, one of which is El Concilio of San Mateo County, and the other is a private contracting firm. But they work with these 2 groups to go into a home and to say, okay, we can fix and we can upgrade an appliance, but while we're here, let's also think about some of the other issues that the home might have, whether that's windows or mold or plumbing, or really anything that is a minor home repair. They're able to do that at the same time to meet some of those deferred maintenance issues that I was talking about earlier. And it's those kinds of partnerships, I think, right, where different organizations can come together to meet multiple needs simultaneously, to leverage other programs, to sort of stack different existing opportunities on top of each other, to have a one-stop shop for residents. That's really, for me, the only way forward with these kinds of programs. The other thing I'll say about this program is that it's completely funded. It's like fully funded. So when a resident works with the Peninsula Clean Energy Home Upgrade Program, they do not pay anything for any of the upgrades that they receive. And I think that's critical for some of the funding incentive structure issues that I mentioned, that really it can be very, very hard to create a system of rebates or incentives that stack on top of each other and can be explained to folks in a clear and easy way of, here is what you're going to have to pay for this, especially given the uncertainty of these kinds of repairs. But to have a program that goes in and says, you will not pay anything for these repairs, is truly the only way to make this accessible for low-income residents. And I see something in the chat, so let's see. Oh, okay, perfect. Next slide. I think the best way to give an example of this one-stop shop nature of the kinds of programs that we need to be moving towards is with one resident that we worked with, gosh, like a year and a half ago now. But this resident called us because her heat in her house hadn't been working for about 2 years, and it was pretty cold last winter. I don't know if any of you have specific memories of this, but just take my word for it. It was cold. Because in 2019, the PG&E inspector had come out to turn on her gas wall heater after it had been shut off for the summer, and discovered that there was a leakage. So there was gas leaking through the furnace. And so the inspector said, I'm sorry, we can't turn this on. And they capped the gas heater. So her family, they bought space heaters. So they got a space heater for every room. But as anyone who has ever used a space heater knows, they work great, but they eat money, I swear. Like their electricity bills went up about double that winter. So it was a workable short-term solution to keep the family warm, but it wasn't a good long-term solution. This family had a young grandson living with them as well, and he'd been having some asthma issues that they were worried was being impacted by some mold that they had in his bedroom from the 1990 flood in East Palo Alto, actually, that had been there and had just not been fully remedied for the last 20 years. So when we came in, and we came in with Peninsula Clean Energy, with El Concilio, with our partners, this is the list of repairs that we were able to provide for this home. So in addition to electrifying two appliances, here at the top, the window wall heat pump for their heat, and then induction oven, induction stove. We also did a bunch of other things. We fixed broken windows and weather stripped around the doors to improve the seal to the house to the outside. We cleaned up the mold, added ventilation to the kitchen so that when they were cooking, it wouldn't just, the air just wouldn't be recirculating, and added some accessibility modifications. So I think this is a great example of just how comprehensive repairs can and should be in order to meet the multifaceted needs of residents. And I think I've said these points already, but I'll say them again. Really what needs to happen in order to build programs that prioritize equitable electrification is to recognize different starting points, to recognize that not all people are going to be equally benefited by a tax credit that gives you, a 40% tax rebate for putting solar panels on your house. We have to be really honest and open about who those kinds of incentive structures are going to help and who's going to be left behind. Which leads directly into the second point of structuring of rebates to increase access. Even better are the types of programs like the ones we have in our county to completely fund these repairs and retrofits. But even if that's not possible, to create rebates that provide money for residents up front to implement the repairs and have some sort of fail-safe for when repairs greatly exceed projected budgets. And the third is to the renter piece, to ensure tenant protections and access to programs for renters. I don't think it's enough to say we'll just open up the accessibility of homeowner-only programs to renters, because we need to think about and talk about the ways in which tenants are left in the lurch for increasing rents, for changing situations, and that any program to bring in renters needs to really explicitly foreground those issues and think about how to do that, whether it's through landlord incentives or other methods. So that was a lot of talking from me. I thank you for listening to me. And I would love to just chat with you all about how we can better meet the needs of under-resourced communities when we think about electrification. I would be curious if there are any questions that anything I said raised for you. If you have any thoughts or from your own experiences thinking about these issues, or just anything that struck you in the presentation, I would love to hear.
Caroline, excuse me, I have a question if no one else has any. We often hear from folks in underserved communities when the electrification is discussed with their homes that there's concern about losing their gas stove because of the cultural value, that there's concern over the health impacts, yes, but also sort of a cultural tie to cooking with gas, that maybe a main household member learned from their grandmother on gas, or doesn't know how to move off of gas, and they might be interested because of the health, but feel like they can't abandon their culture. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The one I hear all the time is that you can't cook tortillas on an induction cooktop, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yep. And I think, to add on to that, I think a second aspect that I hear from folks occasionally in, a little bit of different but similar line of questioning is concern of, well, what if the power goes out? If the power goes out, if the electricity goes out, I can still cook on my gas stove. I can still use these appliances. I can still, get my water heater going. What if I move to everything electric and then I'm just screwed when that happens? They're really different rationales, but I think they speak to the same kind of, yes, this is interesting, but, and thinking about that but is really difficult. We think about a couple things, one of which is that these types of programs that we work with generally don't offer full home electrification. So our go-to is then to say, okay, I get it. Like, I totally understand that there are cultural ties, that there are personal ties to cooking with a gas stove. Like, my mother, I don't think would ever give up her gas stove, despite me telling her over and over to at least use the ventilation fan when she cooks with it. But that there are other appliances and other ways to think about electrification in sort of this slowly moving away from gas without having to give up the stove right away. So when people are especially skeptical about not cooking with their stove, I'll say, well, what about your water heater? How's your water heater looking? You have the same kinds of health issues from the water heater, from the combustion. It's a little different because you're not like standing right there and cooking with it and inhaling it. But to think about other compromises, because really, I think that's a great point, Diane. I think it's a good thing to bring up, is that there are many very reasonable and very rational explanations for not being interested in electrification. And so I think for us, what's key is to make sure that we are articulating the needs in the right ways, to be sharing about the health impacts without, resorting to scare tactics, but really just putting information in front of them and trusting folks to make the decision that is best for them. And that decision is different for different people. We've definitely talked with residents who came in saying, oh, I want to do some of these electrification programs. And then after talking about it, they say, oh, never mind. And that is okay. Like, that's not what we're here to do, is to push electrification down people's throats. That's just my overall thought on that it's not one size fits all, just like we can't think about programs in a top-down way. Yeah. Alex, go for it.
Yeah, I also have been having that question, the one that Diane raised. A different one is, and I think there's at least some like validity behind this claim, that maybe not here in the Bay Area, but in general across, I guess, the nation, is that the grid can't really handle this much electrification so fast. We have pretty like underdeveloped infrastructure.
Totally.
And I've been doing a little bit of research on it, and it seems like it's true. How you probably have a much better understanding than me. I just want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is true, and it is true here in the Bay. We're working with a resident right now in East Palo Alto who, through the Peninsula Clean Energy Program, was approved for a new stove, was ready to go. I think they'd ordered the stove, and then it came time for inspections, and we learned that their block, they were at capacity in terms of what the grid could handle. And so until they were able to update, I think, the transformers, no one else could do any upgrades to their panels. And so we're now in a waiting period with this resident that'll take 6 to 8 months in order to get the capacity for that area up to the place where she can add in her new stove. So it is an issue. It is an issue locally. And I think you're right. I think that the speed of the transition that is required versus the speed that we are technically able to handle right now, that they're not matched up. I think on the plus side for me is that these kinds of upgrades do already take time. And if we're constantly butting up against these kinds of issues over and over, this isn't the first resident we've worked with where this has happened, and it won't be the last. I do think that says something. That says something to people in public office. That says something to the folks at PG&E who are working on the power lines, that if we're constantly at this limit place, that we need to be spending more time to think about how that limit can be expanded. And that's not something that we do a lot of at CRC. We're mostly on the ground at the grassroots level, working with folks to at least get them in the pipeline to be able to receive those types of upgrades. But I totally agree with you. It's a huge issue. And I think if we really invest in electrification in the way that we need to, it's something that will just keep coming up.
Thank you. That was, that answered some of my questions. But do you have like a general idea or like the timeline of how these things work? I just don't really know how long grid electrification into like the capacity it can hold really happens, and kind of what we're on track for and what needs to be done. Like, what are the steps that need to be taken to, I guess, better meet the demand?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question could be answered at a lot of different scales. I think at the biggest scale of thinking about our grid, I'm not an engineer, but I know that the solution is going to be in battery technology. And so I think that battery technology is really important for that. I think what also can't be ignored when thinking about batteries is the importance of local storage. So there's a lot of interesting work happening in terms of storing power from solar panels in local microgrids. And I think that will be an aspect of our transition too, right? Is thinking about, in the same way that CRC is trying to build community power in people, how can we build literal community power? How can we create our grids in a way that will be able to capture and keep energy locally to be able to prepare for those moments where, yes, we are going to be putting a lot of demand on the grid. But I think you can also think about that question that you posed, and I know this isn't the question you were asking, but you can also think about it from a local perspective of how long do these kinds of things take from the individual's perspective. And I can tell you that most people aren't thinking about these kinds of questions. I didn't think about these kinds of questions until I was working at CRC of, the grid and microgrids and battery technology. For people on the ground, what's really important is, okay, there are these programs for me to get a new stove or a new water heater. How long is it going to take until I can actually get it? And what's really hard is that those questions can be hard to answer, be hard to answer because of this uncertainty, right? Of, okay, we thought we were approved for it, but now the transformer of the neighborhood needs to be upgraded. Or, we thought you were approved for it, but it turns out that the model that you were approved for is low in stock at Home Depot because everyone wants these. And I think there's a lot of ways in which uncertainty plays a big role and will continue to play a big role. But just improving our information, investing in these kinds of solutions from the local scale all the way up is the only way forward.
Thank you.
Yeah. These are great questions. I really appreciate the engagement and clearly the expertise, right, that you all are already thinking about from multiple perspectives of Oh,
Oh, hello. This is Tom Cabot. I'm an energy engineer in the utility industry, and I decided also offer another approach that maybe programs can be designed towards promoting very efficient electrification devices. There's even a 110 volt plug in the wall electric range that has a built-in battery so that people could still cook when the power is out and wouldn't need a panel upgrade. So there are ways to work around it, but we just need to pivot towards those more efficient ways so that we stay under the limits of the transformers and giving the utility even more time to get the upgrades done so many neighborhoods can go at once. It all becomes really a matter of right-sizing things and not oversizing things, and then picking the most efficient models that are out there to get the job done. Thanks.
Tom, I really appreciate that point and that perspective. Thank you for sharing that. What that makes me think about is, I think the reason that we do this kind of work at the local scale, and that's because local activism is so much more nimble than top-down approaches. That if I'm thinking about, federal funding that provides the opportunity to do, this type of electric range for these types of homes, it's very regimented, right? But if we're thinking about this from the grassroots perspective, which is the one that CRC is trying to employ, it's that, yeah, we see that emerging technology. We see the ways in which that could actually be the best use for the residents we're working with. And we say, okay, we're using this, we're trying this, we're deploying this strategy. And that's something that I think is a real benefit of local activism and coming at questions from the local level. You can then see how things are working in practice and adjust as you go along based on what's working and what's not. Fantastic. Well, I appreciate the questions. We're getting close to time, so if there are no other questions or thoughts, I'm just really excited to be here and picking all your brains about this. But it's been fantastic to chat. So I'll maybe leave it open for a few more seconds to see if anyone else has questions or thoughts, and then we can wrap up.
I just had one question just about how other members of surrounding communities can help out and support CRC or maybe student groups. The work you're doing is really amazing, and I think there are a lot of intersections between what some of the people on this call are doing as well.
Julia, it's like you knew exactly what my outro was going to be, which was going to be to talk exactly about that. So I appreciate it. Oh, and I see in the chat as well. So let me just, oh, yes. Yes, so here, I will advance just here with my contact info in case anyone wants to follow up. I always love to have these kinds of conversations with folks, so please do be in touch. But there are lots of ways to get involved in this kind of work. I would say first and foremost is that we've worked extensively with student groups and organizations in broader surrounding communities for resource campaigns. So we just wrapped up a big project, mostly in Palo Alto, actually, where we were raising money for 150 air purifiers to distribute to our community members to work on some of these indoor air quality issues. And that was in partnership with 3 churches and 2 synagogues, maybe one or two synagogues. And that was one way that we've worked with other organizations outside of our communities. The other is that we always have opportunities to volunteer and to take part in our work directly. We have a few work days coming up for some planting related projects in East Palo Alto. We have events and workshops on energy efficiency and on electrification, on home repairs, on different programs and resources. we always have in-person and virtual events going on. And so we're always looking for opportunities to work with students, to work with adults, to work with anyone who would be interested in taking part and helping to put together those events. Those, I think, are the two main ways that I always suggest people get involved with us. But you can also passively follow along through our social media or our newsletter, which we send out every month, and we'll have sort of updates on what we're up to and what's coming up. So yeah, thank you for your question. Perfect. All right, well, with that, let me take down my screen so that I can see a few more of you. And again, say thank you for the time this afternoon in chatting, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Saturday, especially on a Saturday. To be spending it in a workshop is quite impressive. So thank you all.
Caroline, thank you so much. You guys do excellent work at CRC.
Thanks, Diane. As do you. We're grateful to have such fantastic partners.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Bye all.